Okay, so we're going to start as I was saying. Welcome to this webinar, which is part of the Global Week of Action for Climate Justice and a Fossil-Free Future. I think I said that right. This is the Dead Justice Day. We have been having actions and both in the streets and online and different webinars throughout the week, focusing on ending fossil fuels, on tax justice for climate justice, on reforming the international financial architecture and the multilateral development banks, on calling out for solutions. And today is the day for debt justice. We organized this webinar within what we call the Debt and Climate Working Group. This is an open space for civil society, activists, social movements that want to work on the interlinks between debt and climate. And we wanted to organize this webinar to highlight why it is important to also focus on debt justice when we are working towards climate justice. We always say that there is no climate justice without debt justice. We'll try to unveil why we say that and why it is important to discuss debt precisely now that we are facing the last part of the negotiations of the new climate finance goal. We will also be disseminating these messages through social media. So we invite you to post messages on Twitter, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on the social medias that you are with the hashtags PayUp and climate debt justice. And we will also give you some work to do at the end of the webinar in that sense. And let's start. Today we have Lidy Nacpil from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, APMDD. Hi, Lidy. Great to have you here. And also Carola Mejia from Red Latinoamericana por la Justicia Económica y Social, which is the Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice, LatinDat. Bienvenida, Carola. And Mariana Poli from Christian Aid and CAN International. Welcome, Mariana, as well. As I said, I will be your moderator from the European Network on Debt and Development. Unfortunately, we had Vanessa Nakate that agreed to join through a video message, but she's from Rise Up Climate Movement and Fridays for Future in Uganda. But she's not feeling well today, so she won't be able to join us, but she hopefully will participate in the campaign later on with video messages. But we have an excellent panel, very knowledgeable. And let me start by asking Carola. The climate and the debt crisis, we say, are inextricably linked. Last week, we had climate negotiators that met in Baku to discuss the new climate finance goal, what is called the new collective quantified goal, NCQG. So it's the new goal for climate finance. Why is it relevant that within those negotiations, we also speak about debt issues? Do you want to start, Carola?
Yes, thank you very much, Iolanda. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. I'm sorry, I'm going to close my camera, but I don't have good connection. Well, first, it is important for the people that is not following climate finance negotiations to let them know that in 2009, according to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, recognizing that there were countries, industrialized countries, that were more responsible for the climate emergency, they have committed to mobilize $100 billion annually to the global south to help us adapt and mitigate climate change. 15 years have passed and nothing has happened. They haven't fulfilled that commitment. They say they had in 2022, but yeah, there is a lot of distrust. There is no transparency because there is, after 30 years of the convention, there is no a single concept agreed about climate finance, what climate finance is, about a methodology, a single methodology that can be used to measure this kind of flows. And this year, as you were mentioning, people is negotiating a new climate finance goal that is going to replace the 100 billion, the unfulfilled commitment of industrialized countries. And of course, that gives us a very important opportunity, not only to improve the quantity and to set an amount that could respond to the real needs of developing countries, but also this gives us the opportunity to discuss all the problems related to climate finance as it is right now. For example, more than 70% of these flows are coming to our countries as loans that we need to repay, that has some high interest rates sometimes when the country is highly vulnerable to climate change. So that is completely unfair. For example, Latin America receives more than 80% in loans. And what the multilateral development banks are mobilizing for climate finance are only mostly loans, are also mostly loans. More than 91% are loans. From these loans, more than 75% are non-concessional loans. That means that they don't have good conditions, considering, for example, the needs of developing countries. And that is completely unfair. This means that developed countries, the climate debtors, the ones that have caused this climate emergency, are the ones that are gaining money from this emergency. They are really giving these loans to our countries, which are already highly indebted in the world. There are around 60 countries highly indebted. Most of them are global south countries. So this is really not helping us. And there are a lot of other problems related to quality, for example, related to access, related to the efficiency of UNFCCC climate mechanisms. For example, the Green Climate Fund, which is the main climate fund worldwide. Sometimes it takes 5 years for one project to be approved. And we have the emergency right now. We are living an emergency. We are already being affected by all the climate impacts in our countries. So this is something that we are trying to raise in these negotiations. The NCQG, what the process you were mentioning, had something good about it, that it was open to observers, it was open to civil society to provide inputs through the technical expert dialogues. And I know Mariana will tell us what happened in Baku later, but I wanted to say that climate finance should not increase the burden in our countries. That is completely unfair, and it's what is bringing us today also to this webinar and the messages we are going to share today in this debt justice and climate justice debt day are very related to that, to those ideas. And there's a lot of relationship, not only to climate finance, but I know we're going to develop more about the relationship between debt and climate. Thank you.
Thank you, gracias, Carola. I think it's very clear, this idea that global South countries shouldn't be more indebted to address a crisis that they didn't create. I think it's clear and simple. Lidy, would you like to add and elaborate a little bit on that profound injustice? Oh, you're on mute, Lidy. You need to be unmuted.
I'm muted. Yeah, so indeed, it's very important to raise the issue of debt in the NCQG negotiations and talks. And what Carol has mentioned is one of the most important reasons why we should be raising this, because climate finance should not be in the form of loans. It really goes against the very principle of climate finance, because climate finance is an acknowledgement of the responsibility of the global north for the climate crisis, and therefore part of accounting for that responsibility is ensuring that there is climate finance being delivered by the global north for the global south, for many different needs of the global south. But it's not in the spirit of helping, it's in the spirit of repaying or reparations for the harms that the global north has caused. So if you're going to give loans as climate finance, expecting that the global south is going to pay back, then this is really very contradictory to that principle. And not just pay back with interest, right? So the more we are burdened. But there's also another reason why it's important to raise debt in the context of these NCQG negotiations. And the NCQG negotiations is about having a new goal for climate finance, so that it is part of the effort to deliver more finance for the global south, so that we can have effective climate action. And if we're not going to address issues that cause the global south to have net resource transfers from the south to the north, no matter how much money we are going to raise and deliver to the global south in terms of climate finance, it's just going to be negated by the flows of interest payments, unfair trade relations, profit remittances, or repatriation of profits from the south, because many of our economies are dominated by multinationals that are from the global north. So if we're not going to address the many ways that the global south keeps on bleeding, not just in terms of finances, but many different kinds of resources that have their financial and monetary value, counterpart value, then it's going to also defeat the purpose of delivering climate finance. We're going to, yeah, have money for climate action, but not have money for all the other reasons why our people are so vulnerable to climate change impacts, because of poverty, because of very poor state of essential services, because there's no livelihoods, there are no jobs that are paying us enough. So how there's which brings me to another important point. You can't how do you say, artificially dichotomize between climate needs and development needs, between climate action and development action. If you're just going to have money for climate and none for development action, what are you actually going to end up with? These are two things that cannot be delinked from each other. So you will have resilience building, but people are poor, will remain poor, and are getting even poorer. So it doesn't really make sense. So while it's not the NCQG negotiators who can do something about the debt, they come from the very same governments who can do something about the debt. So they should hear about the debt even in these arenas and forums.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Lidy. That was very clear, and it is very I would say basic to understand that obviously they need to agree on a quantum, and the different campaigns are putting the number of at least $5 trillion to start on the new climate finance annually, but we need to look also at how this money is delivered, and if the way it is delivered is also affecting development, as you were saying, and poverty levels. So let me turn now into Mariana, because you were in Baku last week, where this technical experts dialogue, the TED 11, happened, and continued the negotiations on this new climate finance goal, the NCQG. So for us, this is very common sense. Is it common sense for the negotiators as well? Are there any good news coming out of those negotiations? Floor is yours, Mariano.
Thanks, Yolanda. And yeah, I wish I had good news, but unfortunately I don't. In fact, it has been shocking how actually it has been 3 years. And 3 years on, and this is still some of the key issues remain unresolved. In fact, as one of my colleagues put out, what we have seen in Baku last week was a giant disgrace. It was a giant disgrace because developed countries are totally refusing to take their responsibility. For example, a number of developing countries have been putting figures on the table, how much money is needed, but developed countries are really unwilling to talk about the quantum, how much money, and instead of actually respecting the, the science, what's needed, and really like looking at their historical responsibility, they want the quantum to be the subject of a political discussion. So we really here under the risk of repeating the same mistakes of the 100 billion in Copenhagen. We also saw, for example, for some of the key areas where we know that private sector investment and loans, etc., don't work, especially like loss and damage, adaptation, unwillingness to include loss and damage on its on right. I think Norway was quite vocal on that, with other developed countries hiding behind it. And also, I think what was quite shocking to some extent is how then, to some extent, developed countries were patronizing really developing countries who were feeling like frustrated. Developed countries told them, they need to be realistic about what that country should look like, which in fact, we look that, for example, the chair of the Africa group of negotiations said, something like that was totally like uncalled for. So I guess the main challenges that we have ahead of us, we are less than 2 months away from the COP. The technical dialogue is over, and it's now all in the hands of ministers for the political bit. And it's really time to ramp up the pressure to call for that responsibility from the Global North to deliver. If we get a weak result at COP, that's going to be developed countries' fault. First and foremost, and this is where we need to have still a lot of work to continue pushing back on that front. If we don't have a minimum quantum of public grant-based, grant equivalent finance, we're going to put a lot of the climate work on jeopardy. So the risk that we have then a lot more lending, a lot more debt being part of the picture.
Wow, so as you said, not very good news, but also a lot of work for us, and yet another reason for us to be here sharing this and stepping up the work. Let me go back to you, Lidy. Mariana said that the Global North negotiators always put on the table this "be realistic" and sentence, but the reality is stubborn, and it's in our side, and those links between debt and climate go beyond the climate finance issue. We always say this thing that there is no climate justice without debt justice, and we put on the table the need to acknowledge the climate debt and repair that climate debt. I would like you to speak a little bit about that. You're muted again. Sorry.
I thought I was unmuted. So climate debt. One of the things that we have been raising for a long time already, whenever the North comes around and tells the South, you have to pay back your financial debts and so on and so forth. We can give you some debt relief, but the debt needs to be paid and so on and so forth. We have always argued back, but you owe us a great deal more than what we are supposed to be owing you in terms of financial debts, because there's a huge historical, economic, and ecological debt that is owed the South. And part of that is climate debt. I mean, the debt owed to us is much bigger than climate debt, but climate debt itself is already huge because the North has been primarily responsible for the historical accumulated emissions in the last 170 years that is responsible for global warming and climate change. And we all know by science that emissions of more than 100 years ago are still relevant today because they're still in the atmosphere. So we still can call upon the responsibility of those who actually contributed to that emission. So they owe us because they've caused this crisis. Now we are suffering all sorts of impacts. We are now burdened with making sure there's a rapid phase out of fossil fuels and a rapid development of 100% renewable energy systems. We all have to make sure that the world decarbonizes by 2050. And what makes it even more unfair is that the rich have already gotten rich. The rich countries have gained their wealth out of this exploitative system. And they have a lot more capacity to do all this phase out and to do all this transition than the South, we are struggling even to put up the most basic, efficient services, essential services. We're struggling already for that. What more decarbonization and setting up new technologies and infrastructures and so on. So that climate finance that has to be part of this reparations for climate debt is supposed to cover a lot of things, mitigation or reducing emissions as it's meant, but that includes the whole energy transition process, adaptation, building resilience, and addressing loss and damage. And these climate finance flows, I must really emphasize, it has to be huge, but it will not mean much, or it will not make much impact if we are still saddled with problems like debt domination, because we are going to continue to lose finances and resources. So debt cancellation should be one of the urgent actions that have to be taken by the global North governments and the financial institutions that they control. And by debt cancellation, we don't mean that that's part of the contribution of climate finance. That cannot be double counted. Climate finance must be new and additional. And we have our own justice reasons for debt cancellation. This is the money that we have been paying and that the debts that we were forced to take, as people. Of course, our governments were complicit with the global North for many of these debts. But we're not supposed to be paying these debts in any case because we haven't really benefited from this debt. So to cancel the debt and count that as part of your climate finance and your reparations doesn't make sense either. It's not just, it's not logical. So just saying out there that debt cancellation is a separate urgent demand that we need to make aside from claiming their, fulfilling their climate finance obligations.
Thank you. Thanks, Lidy. That was very clear. Let me add yet another element into the discussion and going back to Carola. Because as you said, climate debt is just one part of this huge historical, ecological, social debt that the global North owes to the global South. And part of that ecological debt is also due to extractivism. And Carola, Latindad has just published a report on debt, climate, and extractivism in the Amazon, and I would like you to talk to us about how these three elements connect to each other. What are the conclusions of that research? Carola, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you, Iolanda. Yes, we have last year we have started a project in Amazon in 5 Amazon countries: Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Suriname. And we started analyzing this vicious circle between the climate emergency, debt, and extractivism. And with the analysis we did in each country, thanks to some partners in each country, we could demonstrate that these problems are interlinked, that these problems are need more comprehensive solutions, systemic changes. And we notice also that there are different contexts between the countries. For example, my country, Bolivia, is already in this logic of the vicious circle, and it's very, very complicated right now. It is highly indebted. and it's the government to pay and repay these debts is investing and promoting extractive practices in protected areas in the Amazon region. They are trying to promote mining, a more hydrocarbon prospection, exploration, and exploitation. They are promoting laws that allow the agribusiness to expand their lands. So that is causing the fires, for example, that we are suffering now. And all of this is affecting the local communities that are living in our countries, in forests, in these regions that are so sensitive and so important, naturally speaking. They are super biodiverse, and yeah, we are depleting them because we need dollars to repay their debts, and because this idea of economic growth as the objective hasn't changed with the years, and Bolivia is in a really tough situation right now, and Colombia and Ecuador have similar problems. We demonstrated that debt has increased a lot in the last years. Debt service is receiving more public money than climate action in all of the countries. Colombia and Peru are all dependent. Their incomes are reliant on extractive sectors and in the exports of oil and hydrocarbons to the world. And of course, we can see different political signs as well. For example, Colombia has is a good example of political will to change the things. President Petro last year announced in COP28 that Colombia was joining the non-proliferation treaty of hydrocarbons in the Amazon. So that is important. That was a very important sign. In Ecuador, we could see an important sign coming from the civil society. There was a public consultation regarding hydrocarbons exploitation in a natural reserve called Yasuni, and the people voted and they decided not to exploit hydrocarbons in the area. So that was a really important precedent coming from civil society. In case of Suriname, we saw that they are being put to this vicious circle because Suriname had a huge debt. It was highly indebted. But in terms of deforestation and in terms of carbon emissions, Suriname absorbs more carbon dioxide, CO2, than what it emits. It has a lot of forest still there, but due to this high debt and the renegotiation and the IMF program they have their debt restructured, but they are now conditioned to exploit hydrocarbons offshore. So the people that has restructured the debts and allowed this is going to receive royalties from these activities. So that is completely unfair as well. And Suriname is being pushed to this vicious circle that is going to affect them and condemn them to rely on hydrocarbons, exploitation to repay this kind of debt. And in the case of Peru, we saw that Peru didn't have like a high debt, but it has a extractive model of development that is really terrible. And it is approving laws that are reducing the rights of indigenous peoples in the protected areas, in the natural areas of the Amazon. It is promoting mining, promoting extractivism vastly, and that is not really benefiting the country, but multinational companies. And we, during this analysis, we also saw who are the countries that we owe these financial debts. And we could see clearly that these countries are the same that are in the ranking of the climate debtors, the ecological debtors. So it is completely unfair. They are really controlling the financial system. And we are demanding a reform in the financial system, a reform in the governance of international financial institutions, multilateral development banks, that even in Latin America, for example, the IDB, which is a very important creditor of our countries, it is owned and directed by the United States, who has the presidency, who is the one making the decisions. And our countries that are highly vulnerable to climate change are not really, doesn't have voice in this kind of boards of these institutions. They don't have the possibility to change things. And it is not responding. So we need different approaches, different solutions, and real solutions to tackle all these three elements, and to transform our economies, and to move out from this dependency of hydrocarbon, fossil fuels, mining, because otherwise we're just going to be worse.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Carola. That was also very clear. And we posted one of your reports. I think it's the Suriname one in the chat, but all of them are available, and also a briefing that Justice UK lead on, and some of us contributed to on this debt and fossil fuel trap, which takes me to thinking very directly of the IMF and the World Bank and the IFIs, because these are institutions that have pushed for this trap. We hear a lot about the need for the World Bank to increase the climate finance, or for the IMF to increase the resources that they lend, because these organizations always lend towards resilience and climate action. But I want to ask Mariana, is this a good idea? Is this good news to include the World Bank or the multilateral development banks and the IMF into climate action, the way things are today?
We really need not just a reform, but we need a transformation in the international financial system, because those institutions are really to blame for a lot of the inequality and the issues that we're living today. So there's no role for them as they operate in business usual. And when you think, well, the World Bank, it's a bank, and as such, most of the climate finance is loans based, after all. And a number of those loans also come through either from World Bank or the IMF with a number of conditionalities. When for example, that 85% of the world's population is already living under a number of austerity measures. So a number of conditionalities are coming also on this sense. We also have the problem that those institutions who were created like 80 years ago are largely controlled by the global north, when we actually, most of the countries affected by climate won't have very little say on the table, where they should have a lot more voice and participation. So climate finance must be distributed to more democratic spaces, the UN, and established under the UNFCCC, Global Climate Fund, etc. So another problem, and I think it's quite concerning, and we saw that within the talks, is how the whole narrative that we're watching on the the World Bank wanting to be bigger and better is really about privileging private sector first approach to deliver goods instead of the public goods. And that's not a silver bullet. We need back on the very little grants is really done given underneath that. We also know that the bank and a number of FDBs are also funding a lot of fossil fuels. Billions are still going to fossil fuels. So there is no role for those institutions to deliver climate finance without ending their fossil fuel financing as well. So business as usual approaches, as we're watching, are just not working. If we don't look at climate finance without making that connection, as we're doing here with the debt, and how we can really increase the fiscal space to free the resources for climate and development needs, that's just it's not going to work.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mariana, for that. As they say in English, the devil is in the detail. So it's not only about agreeing we will provide so much, but also how this is being done and through what institutions and what changes do we need to promote in these institutions. Let's talk more about the solutions. There has been a lot of talk lately, for instance, about debt for climate swaps, but also about these new climate clauses that everyone is talking about, that they add to loans and bonds, so countries can stop paying their debts if a hurricane or another climate-related event hits. And these are taking quite some space in the NCQG negotiations, as far as I know, the push for debt swaps and climate clauses. So I wanted to ask Lidy, what about these solutions? Are these good proposals?
Well, before I answer that, Yolanda, allow me to just add to what Mariana said about the World Bank and the multilateral banks. I just like to, very sharply reiterate the point that any so-called climate finance that flows through these undemocratic institutions, we do not consider as part of the fulfillment of obligations for climate finance, because climate finance should be delivered directly to the global south through climate finance channels that are democratic, and we're still fighting the good fight to make sure that the Green Climate Fund is democratic and accountable. So that's not something that has been handed to us like on a silver platter. And that means we also have to fight for a loss and damage fund that is democratic. So it's a continuing fight. Now, just on the debt swap, I would like to just say that based on first the point, based on the general principle that funds from debt relief arrangements and debt cancellation arrangements, we do not consider as part of fulfilling climate finance obligations, because that in itself has its standalone reasons why we are demanding debt cancellation. And secondly, we don't consider generally debt swaps as a good way to address debt domination, to address unsustainable debt and illegitimate debt. For sure, there might be some exceptional arrangements that could work. So we're not completely ruling that out. But we need to also be aware that agreeing to debt swaps is agreeing to the legitimacy of whatever debts are going to be considered as part of the swaps. You're not going to accept a debt swap and then later complain about the loans that were contracted for in the debts that you're going to swap, because that's already acknowledging the legitimacy and that you actually own that's owe those debts. So that's one of the fundamental reasons why we can't just accept debt swaps as a major response to the debt problem. There are many, and I'm sure there's a lot of materials out there, including the one that Eurodad has issued before, that talks about in detail why debt swaps, instead of actually working for the South, in many ways work against our interests. So we really need to be very vigilant and very vocal against what we would term as false finance solutions. False solutions to not just the problem of climate finance, but the problem of dealing with debt and and resolving the debt crisis.
Thanks. And Lidy, before I let you go, I forgot to ask you something when we were talking about fossil fuels, and it links to what you were saying now, that you need to look at what are the debts that you're proposing to swap. And if these are illegitimate debts, it needs to be right away and not just canceled, but like annulled. And you wrote something not long ago about the illegitimacy of fossil fuel debts. So I wanted to ask you about that also.
Yes. One of the long-standing arguments we've had about debts that we should consider illegitimate is that if these debts were used for harmful projects. So it's it's going to be a lot of deaths because there has been a lot of harmful projects that was carried out in the South that were financed with debts. But we'd like to focus the attention on illegitimate debts at this time because there's already worldwide recognition that fossil fuel is bad for humanity and the planet at this point, because we've already exceeded the capacity of the Earth to absorb fossil fuels healthily in a healthy way. So the next logical step is to acknowledge that lending for fossil fuel projects first should stop. And secondly, outstanding loans from those projects should be canceled because they are illegitimate. They were used for harmful projects. If you're all agreeing that fossil fuels is harmful, then all the loans that you pushed our way to build these fossil fuel projects, you should cancel. No, it reminds me, and this is even to a little bit lesser extent in terms of risk and danger and harms. It reminds me about the landmark decision of the government of Norway in 2006 to cancel the debts, the loans that they lent to countries in the South, for these countries to be able to purchase Norwegian ships, because the Norwegian government acknowledged that they were not being responsible in pushing the sale of these Norwegian ships and the lending for these Norwegian ships because they were not appropriate for these countries. They were not what they needed, and it's not a good practice. It's irresponsible practice to be pushing loans to buy this, useless things for the South. And we're not even talking about useless things here. We're talking about really harmful projects. So that's I think now I think for the debt movement is the time to push for cancellation immediately of these illegitimate debts that arose from fossil fuel projects.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Carola, let me get to you also on this issue of the debt swaps as sort of false solutions, because Latin that has been following very closely some of these initiatives, and if you wanted to address some other things on this one.
Yes, thank you, Iolanda. With CEDES, we have and Eurodad, we have been analyzing the debt swap in Galapagos that was announced as the biggest and most important debt swap lately. And it was for conservation, but it followed a very complex mechanism with issues of a blue bond, a new loan, guarantees from the IDB, and different financial institutions involved, and also private sector. And 1 year has already passed, and we have been first when the operation happened. We analyzed this, and we found that there wasn't enough public information about the details about these new operations and the conditions for the country. And we started analyzing also the structure of the Galapagos Life Fund, which was established. And we found that in the board was mostly done by representatives of the private sector. So that affected also the sovereignty of the country regarding the decisions that are going to be taken in that particular region. We noticed that there weren't enough public information, and CEDES had to rely on legal instruments to demand the publication of those data, that information. And after 1 year, what we noticed is that there wasn't like a disbursement of $1 for conservation. We found that the Galapagos Life Fund didn't have a website. The IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank that gave a warranty about this debt swap to the government was failing on the monitoring of the operation. So we started a process within the IDB. It's called the MISI, where you can report some things that you don't see that are happening well. And the MISI went to Galapagos to find out more about the details. And I think that pressure from our side made the Galapagos Life Fund to publish a website, to publish a report, and start giving more information. But we could talk with the local stakeholders of Galapagos And they said they were never consulted about having a Galapagos Life Fund or debt swap for the conservation of that area. So that was something that the IDB MISI was this mechanism of reporting these kind of things evidenced when they went to the site to interview the local people, and it was clear that the operation was not really participatory. The operation was involved a lot of private sector interests, and right now 1 year has happened and nothing. There is no money going to conservation projects. So that's why we say that this is not like a silver bullet to tackle nor the climate emergency nor the debt crisis. And when we analyze the portion of the relief or the portion of money going to climate action or conservation, we can see that it's really short compared to what it is needed. And it's something that is important to know, because in these negotiations of the new collective quantified goal, the new climate finance goal, the negotiators, especially from the South, are raising the problem of debt. And global North countries and the international financial institutions are promoting these debt swaps as the real solution, and it is not. It is not, and it has a lot of limitations. There are no principles, and we are demanding these kind of principles for the establishment of new debt swaps: transparency, respect to sovereignty of a country, equality in the negotiation of the conditions of this kind of debt swaps. Also, the participatory element that is very important, not to leave the people directly affected behind. So those are some things, and we invite you to read all the reports and things that we have been publishing about this case.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. That's it's an excellent work that Latindad and others have been doing, following these problematic practices in the debt swap in Ecuador, and I think also an example for others to follow in similar cases. So we see that there are false solutions that some particularly global North countries push, other no solutions, which is like increasing World Bank, IMF lending. But we also heard from the speakers about what solutions we could put on the table. First and foremost, debt-free climate finance that is sufficient, that is additional and new, as Lidy was saying. The need for debt cancellation, which is also not part of the climate finance, but something else, particularly canceling illegitimate debts, and particularly from fossil fuel-linked loans, but also not pushing for fossil fuels and extractivism to pay debt, transforming international financial architecture and the recognition of climate debt and reparations. So we have plenty of solutions. I'm gonna open now the floor for interventions, questions, and answers. There is a question in the chat from, let me see the name, from Justice here. I'm gonna open the floor for you, Justice. Let me see if I can do this correctly here. So come on, pose your question and comment, because I found it very interesting.
Okay, good afternoon. I would like to thank all the speakers for the good work that actually they are doing. But the challenge that I'm actually seeing in all these discussions is like, if we do not have legally binding frameworks, for me, as far as I'm concerned, we are not going anywhere. I'll give an example. Since 1992 up to now, then we went to Paris, where we actually have the Paris Agreement. And all these agreements sounded like they were talk shows or gentlemen's agreement, because they were not, or they are not legally binding. So as long as we do not have the legal frameworks, we might have so many claims or whatever, but as long as we do not have the means to litigate those who are actually, causing all these challenges that we are facing, it's a non-starter. So what we then have to do now is to say, why can't we just maybe say transform the legal systems, right? And have legal frameworks in place that really creates platforms where the global south can be in a position to sue the global north or certain companies so that we get compensation or reparation. Without proper or legally binding solutions, I don't think we can be talking until cause come home, but we are not going to receive or get whatever compensation that we claim. I'll give an example. During the Paris Agreement, countries agreed to, pay or contribute $100 billion per year. But how many have been actually, honored that promise? None. So they are still owing, right? And then now we are saying we are going to increase to a trillion. Yes, that's fine. But as long as we just, this is ambitious. It's good to be, very ambitious. But we have to call for legally, binding agreements, or have an institution that represents the vulnerable communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Justice. I think it is a key question, like how we, even if we reach a good agreement, how we make that agreement to become real and so countries in the global north don't just ignore it. We also have an interesting intervention from Farouk Tariq. He's a colleague from Pakistan. I don't know, Farouk, if you would like to come in and explain a little bit this case of Pakistan, which is very interesting. I'm gonna open the mic for you. You're available.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I just wrote in the chat box that Pakistan, we were making noise that where the money has gone, which has been received for compensation of climate disaster victims. So they disclosed that their estimate was $30 billion and they received $10 billion, mainly as loans. But we don't know really where that money has been spent, because over 80% of the climate victims are not compensated, as we know from our own experiences and from our own reports. And then we also hear that Pakistan has to pay back a large amount during this year. And Pakistan is very efficient to repay the foreign loan because they want to qualify. And they always try to frighten us. We don't like Sri Lankan situation. We are avoiding the bankruptcy of the country and so on. So we have to fulfill the conditionalities. So at this time, there is a historic high price hike in Pakistan. As a unit of electricity is over 23 cents of a dollar, which is one of the highest in the world. And I know many comrades and workers whose wages are around 30,000 and their electricity bill is over 20,000. So you can see how they could be surviving the hike in electricity, not only electricity, in gas as well. And also many other things. Most of the fruit and vegetables are exported rather than selling in the local market just to earn money. So Pakistani ruling elite do not see a life without IMF. They say they have to please the IMF. And IMF is very unpopular in Pakistan. Unlike Sri Lanka, what was the case at the time. People hate IMF because they know this is the conditionalities. But ruling classes are taking refuge that we are forced to do this. Although they have a choice. They have a choice to say, we can't pay. We don't have the money. We can't pay, but they don't do it. And the result is inequalities at the highest, poverty ever increasing, over 20 million children out of schools. We have still polio victims in Pakistan. So all the illnesses is not been eroded. Very little money on social sector, and most of the budget is been spent on repayment of the foreign loan. So we are campaigning in Pakistan that this we must not pay. As Lidy said earlier, the legitimate debt of Pakistan must not be paid. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Farouk, for joining and for sharing the example of Pakistan, which I think it's very clear and evidences the problems of that we're talking about today. I'm going to go back to the speakers now with also a couple of questions in the chat. I think Mohammed also asked about if countries are global South countries are organizing these climate funds to work with grassroots level, because that's also another problem. Like once the climate finance is delivered, if they reach the populations, they reach the communities, they reach the grassroots. And also Paul asked about what alternatives have global South countries to fund the transition, the energy transition, if the powerful countries refuse to offer or fund these transition processes. So I don't know who wants to start. And there is the question of how do we make this climate finance commitments enforceable?
Yolanda, if you want,
yes?
I can start responding the first question about the National Climate Fund. I can give an example of a national climate fund in Brazil, which is the Amazon Fund. It is working very well, considering it is allocating money from public money, private money to local climate action projects in the form of subsidies and grants. So I think that is important, and it is very focused on the Amazon. And I think it works with grassroots organizations. I'm not sure about the details of the projects, but I think it is an example of how a country can establish a climate fund with nationally and try to channel money from international money, national money, from the private and public sector to give direct access to the local stakeholders. I think that is the challenge, and this kind of fund it is given a good example.
Thank you, Carola. Lidy?
Yeah, first to maybe address the first question, which is about what is legally binding and legally enforceable. So actually, all of these climate agreements are legally binding. You know, the basic agreement, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which includes the obligations of developed country parties to deliver finance for developing country parties, but without mentioning how much. This is legally binding. The Kyoto Protocol that emerged out of that convention, which is designed to operationalize the agreements in the convention, was legally binding. Was because, you know, it expired when it was replaced by the Paris Agreement, passed in 2015, adopted in came into force in 2016, is legally binding. Now, the problem with international law is, where do you seek redress if the agreements are not being honored and if the obligations are not being fulfilled? So we don't have enough established international courts for us to be able to do this, but there has been already efforts, you know, to place cases before the International Court of Justice, for instance, and even litigation in national courts. And there are several examples where there has been some kind of breakthrough wins, not on the question of climate finance, but on the question of emissions, on the question of pollution, on the question of fossil fuels, and so on. So it would be interesting if we can find a first case, if we can have an experience of filing a case against governments of developed countries or the global north for failing on their legally binding commitment to deliver climate finance. I don't think the point should be about winning, because I think the point should be about creating these platforms where we can really expose and argue. So that would be an interesting initiative, I think.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Mariana?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I just wanted to come in, I think, with post questions in terms of, where can the money come from if the North doesn't deliver. First of all, I think this is something that developing countries, the civil society needs to be fighting over and over for that climate finance to be provided. I think there's not acceptance of on that place, but there is making the connection in terms of increasing the fiscal space for climate action, not just looking to the debt issue, not repaying debt, but also on taxation, and especially combating, as we're looking at the efforts through the UN tax convention, for example, what can be done to combat, tax evasion, tax avoidance, etc., and a lot of, illicit financial flows. How much I know those countries are missing on that front. Also, equally, we know how much ridiculous profits that a number of multinational companies are doing, making polluters pay, etc. I think there are instances that could also be a part of the picture, but that should not remove the obligation of developed countries to fulfill the bill first and foremost.
Thank you. I see several comments in the chat, but only one kind of question from Jonathan, and I'm also wondering about this, which is, it seems that we're heading at the very depressing result of the NCQG negotiations. Obviously, we are here to step up our work, but it is not optimistic. And he says, I wanted to ask, how do you see debt and climate forming part of the Jubilee year in 2025, and also financing for development conference next summer? I don't know, Jonathan, if you want to come in to explain a little bit this before I pass on to the speakers. If so, I can, sorry. I can give you speaking. Where's Jonathan? Here. Would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, thanks, Iolanda. I mean, I think you did a good job of covering it. Yeah, I guess, of course, it's the job of civil society to push for ambition, but the developed countries are really avoiding responsibility, right? And so I just wonder, especially also thinking ahead to next year as a Jubilee year, whether we need, as civil society, we need to be ramping up efforts around kind of reparations framing for next year. And whether people are already kind of like strategizing about that, we would be happy to support those efforts at the Bretton Woods Project. Over.
Thanks, John. Anyone else? I don't see any other questions. You can raise your hand also if you want to come in. If not, I'll go back to the speakers for a last round on mobilizations next year, but also ask you to put on the table one of the solutions that you would push in this process. No questions. So let's go back to the panel, and Lidy, do you want to start?
what do you want me to focus on in terms of the questions of next year? What are we going to do?
Next year, what are we going to do? And what are we
Yeah.
going to do also to avoid a failure of COP29 and these NCQG negotiations?
Well, let me just say that realistically, given the current political conditions in our governments, the global North governments, and so on, we are preparing for being disappointed, severely disappointed in Baku, but we are preparing to fight hard in Baku at COP29. And we're already fighting hard in the processes that are leading up to Baku. For instance, Mariana's engagement at the NCQG process just the past week is part of this. I think it's important to say that we need to be prepared that this is going to be a long fight. We don't want it to be too long because we're running out of time, but we can't set up ourselves as if we can realistically expect that we will win everything that we want to win within just a few months. No, what really what the things that are at stake are huge, and it really requires a great big effort on the part of civil society to generate the kind of political pressure that is required to compel the governments to do even half of what we are saying or what we are demanding as what they need to do or is their duty to do. So from the current balance of forces and political situation, we're not going to expect a lot of great results in Baku, but we must turn this into an opportunity to step up the pressure. So in Baku, what we are planning in terms of strategy is what sort of major bold actions can we do, and can we encourage the allies among developing country parties can do in Baku to dramatize this. And this is not just a I don't know how you say in English, shooting for the moon or something like that. Because for instance, in Warsaw, and this is one of the memorable occasions when we all got together, the civil society and developing country parties, our allies among them, civil society staged a walkout in Warsaw. And then the Africa group also led a developing country parties walkout in Warsaw. The issue is similar to now, was about finance, but particularly loss and damage. And that is the reason why Warsaw came out with this Warsaw international mechanism for loss and damage, because the developing countries and civil society just really put our foot down. Wasn't what we were asking for. We were asking for more, but certainly what we did in Warsaw paved the way eventually for us to win in Sharm el Sheikh, this loss and damage fund. It took so many years. That's about 9 years of campaigning, but that we all know as campaigners, that's how long it takes, and even far longer. And we need to also look at Belém. What's the next step? Or Brazil, what's the next step after COP29? But it's not only what we do during these COPs. It's most important what we do in these periods between COPs, because we are compelling governments to act. So we can't just show up at the COPs and that's the only time we talk. That's why we have this Global Week of Action, for instance, that is timed at the UN General Assembly. So another important occasion to raise finance would be the UN FFD process next year. So I know a number of us are also involved. We know that it's not the UN FFD that will decide on many of these issues, but it is an opportunity to use it as a platform to keep up the pressure and keep on raising the demands that we are raising. But before that, we need to go through Baku first and make a big fight. Step up the fight in Baku. We don't fight only when we are sure to win. That's certainly not the way to do it. Thank you.
That's definitely not the way that we have been doing it.
Yes.
And we always fight when we are also far from what we want and what the world needs. Carola, Mariana, do you want to come in? Mariana, I see your microphone open.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess one of my reflection, because as Lidy said, you know, as we are prepared for a bad outcome in Baku, we're really prepared to fight. But to some extent, I would believe that no outcome is better than a bad outcome in Baku. So we have to see how things will pan out, and we really have to work hard with a number of, you know, developing countries on that front. And that's why I really think on the linking with the FFD next year, it's really an important opportunity to address the climate and debt connection, because if we don't really think about the finance without the debt, and without having the opportunity that we might have FFD to have a UN debt workout mechanism, that would be essential. The fact that the Africa managed to really kickstart the process that's now happening with the UN tax convention has shown that that's possible. And to some extent, I think for FFD next year, could be a good platform to do that. So we need to connect the dots, not just on the debt, but also in terms of how and who controls how the climate finance is dispersed. We cannot have just the, you know, developed countries, those who are controlling the international financial institutions making the decision. We have to democratize global decision making. So challenging the governance of climate finance, of how decisions are taken, to have more voice and participation in the global south is also key. And to some extent, FFD4 is a good platform to advance that. Of course, some of us campaign on, you know, quota reform of the IMF and the shares of the bank, but that's be a good opportunity to do that as well.
Thank you, Mariana. Carola?
Yes, I completely agree with Lidy and Mariana. Next year, FFD gives us a good opportunity. But I also agree with John that the Jubilee year next year is going to be important to push for debt cancellation to respond to the current climate emergency. I think we need to work together to really keep pushing. I know that things are not going to be easy. I'm also not expecting good results for this COP29. But we are there trying to make the efforts to lead our governments, especially from the global south, to propose to fight for a fair climate finance to be delivered in this new collective quantified goal, this new climate finance goal that is going to be set. And I think that is a important work that we from civil society need to keep doing, keep analyzing, provide reports, information, evidence that shows that how some things are all solutions, what proposals do we need to push. And in Latin America, we're also we're expecting 2025 also, because COP30 is going to be here in Brazil, in the Amazon. And for us, it is, like Lidy was saying, it is a process that is already going on to unite the voices of the local voices to really fight for real solutions. And I think the process is already going, and we are working very hard to really fight for these changes and this political will to change the things in the short time we have.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Carola. So as I think all of us are saying, it's mobilize, mobilize, and mobilize, and do our research, put the evidences out there, do the advocacy, but also keep up with bringing people together and having strong pressure to those governments. And I think that is particularly relevant for those in the global north, that we need to put more pressure into our governments to deliver on what is needed. Before we end, I'm gonna share my screen in a second, because we wanted to share with you what we are doing today also on social media. I hope you are seeing my screen now. So I think it was John who was asking to go back to the demands. debt-free climate finance, canceling the debt, also including new legislation in major jurisdictions like New York and UK to get debt cancellation actually work, promoting a systemic debt architecture reform, including a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt, which is something we're calling for in the financing for development process. No more fossil fuels for debt, so stop pushing fossil fuel exploitation and extractivism to pay up debt. Obviously, what Lidy was saying, debts accrued from fossil fuel projects are illegitimate and they need to be immediately and unconditionally cancelled. We're also calling for an automatic debt payments cancellation in the wake of catastrophic external events, so go beyond the debt clauses, and recognition and paying up climate debt. The global north countries also need to provide the climate finance beyond paying up, beyond the reparations. And no false finance solutions. Stop pushing for false finance solutions and focus on the real solutions. So we are proposing you, and I'm going to post these things on your social media, on your X or Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, even on LinkedIn. You have a link that I just shared in the chat, and you can go, I think it's page 3, and you have several examples, but you can do your own, obviously, on messages that you could share, particularly today, because we want to make a push today, but also in the following days and the following months. This is a long fight on the messages that we shared today. We also even added a proposal to copy paste or do your own message on LinkedIn, if you're on LinkedIn, because we saw that both the co-facilitators of the NCQG process, they are not both in X or Facebook, but they are both in LinkedIn. So we could send them a message with our proposals. Here you have a message. And here you have, and I'm going to share this right now as well, a poster that we adapted from the Pay Up campaign on Pay Up Your Climate Debt. So we would love that you could also share that on your social media. Here is this. I see, Justice, you have a question. We have like 10 minutes, so I can give you the floor. But please do start sharing on the internet. Justice, come in.
Right. Thank you so much. I've got 3 quick issues that are pending. The first one is in respect with to the messages that we always keep on changing year in, year out. I think some of these government officials won't take us serious because today we've got this message and then we change it maybe next year. You know, sometimes we need to have an impact. If we stick to our message or to our demands, maybe let's take those demands, maybe say for 3 to 4 COPs, we are saying, these are our demands for the next 3 years, because we need to be very strategic than actually keeping on changing the messages. This year we've got, another message. Next year we've got, they get confused. But if we stick to, like this year we say, we are running with these messages from COP29 up to maybe say COP 31. These are the messages that we're going to stick to. I know we are going to have an impact. Number 2 thing, we need to actually say, right? We have, because normally we actually strategize when we're towards COP. For me, it doesn't really make we cannot have an impact. Why can't we just say soon after COP, right? We do our environmental scanning, who is doing what, where, right? How then can we bring all those players on board and start strategizing, using the same message that we have today, this time around, to say these are the same messages we communicate, than actually keeping on changing the messages. Sometimes, it doesn't have an impact. Then the other thing that I also wanted to actually talk about is like, we really need to have a strong position or a strategy that we are going to adopt or that speaks to debt cancellation, right? And these are some of the demands that we can even use when you're advocating for maybe establishment of what the tribunals or whatever courts, right? We can even go through the ICCJ, right? International Criminal Court of Justice. So we need these messages to be, constant, for lack of a better word, we need to continually use the same message, maybe for the next 3 years, than actually keeping on changing the messages. Really, sometimes, I get confused as well. So, and lastly, we need to ensure that these messages, we start at national level, right? We actually come up with these positions and then we share with our group of negotiators at country level, regional level, continental level. Then we are then saying, these are the messages that we're going to be running with for the next 3 years. And we are going to be bothering them so much, using the same messages, using the same strategy, because sometimes changing that message again, really, it gives problems to, even to the negotiators. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Justice. That question is, or comment more than question, proposal, links to my next message, actually, that I had prepared. I think we have been consistent since 2020, 2021. We started working together on these interlinks between debt and climate, and we created this debt and climate working group. So there are several networks and organizations participating. We have monthly meetings, we have a coordination group, and we are trying to be, as you were suggesting, Justice, consistent on the message. So particularly on our public messaging, on our campaigns, on our awareness raising, but also on our advocacy. So for instance, you have been saying today several ideas to share your messages on social media, to do campaigns. There have been mobilizations in the last week and will continue throughout the week. But those same messages were part of a joint submission that we send to all the negotiators and governments in the NCQG process. So we do both. I don't know if you want to have a last minute word, Lidy, Mariana, Carola, on this. No? Okay, so here we end our webinar. You have the links. We will share them on email if you registered. Please do share your messages on social media. Please disseminate the work, but also we invite you to be part of this working group. I posted the email from Tess, who manages also a WhatsApp group, our mailing list, and therefore we will continue throughout this week for the Pay Up campaign through COP29 with the COP29 coalition and the different collective efforts, but also next year and unfortunately probably the following years, but next year particularly with this Jubilee 2025, the Cancel the Debt campaigns, the Financing for Development Conference, which is an advocacy opportunity, the COP30 in Brazil. So we have several opportunities to be, as Justice was saying, consistent with our messages, both in the streets, in the internet, and in the advocacy spaces. So thank you all for joining, and I wish you have a good day, and please join the mobilizations this week.
Thank you, Iolanda.
Thank you.
Juan,
Thank you all.
Mariana, and Carola. Thank you.